Is the U.S. economy on the edge of the biggest bust in history, or will there be one last boom?
Yeah, hi, Alex. Great to see you again. I think there's one last, what I've been calling a melt up, a final run to a top. Depends on what people think in terms of close, what the word means. I think we could see a bust as early as the end of this year, and bust I define as something bigger than a typical recession. Feels like a depression, probably bigger, something like 2008-9 on steroids, but happened within a time frame of a recession, not drawn out like the Great Depression. So it's definitely a very serious downturn and will come with what could be the biggest financial crisis in history. Yeah, from the standpoint of how big it is and the fact that we haven't seen a bust since the Great Depression, it's close. But close means months, many months still to run, I think. Doesn't mean it's imminent. Whereas, as you're saying, I think a lot of people think we're starting the bust now. So I'm not in that camp at all. I think between now and say the end of the summer, we're going to have perhaps one of the biggest rallies in history.
Wow. I want to get into that. So we last spoke in December. You were sort of looking at, maybe the markets were going to extend and melt up into Q2 at the most, sort of Q3, I think. Now, Trump, Liberation Day, that all went off the rails. We saw huge corrections. The NASDAQ's down more than 20%. The markets are climbing back a bit. The melt up is back on. Do you have any targets when it comes to the S&P? I know you were looking at 7,500 before. Is that still in the cards?
Yeah, actually, in the midst of the sell-off, when we were down below 5,000, I raised my target to 8,000. So while everybody else was getting more bearish and dropping targets and saying we could go to 4,000, we could go, people were playing leapfrog in terms of how low we can go, I actually got more bullish. And it's partly because I am a contrarian and sentiment plays a big part in. And at the bottom a couple of weeks ago, we were looking at sentiment that was, by some measures, back to 2008-9, by other measures, back to the bottom in 2022. And yes, we sure had a sell-off in a hurry, but it was not that kind of thing. And yet that's where people's minds are at. They were already very skeptical about this market, one foot out the door thinking, this thing could roll over at any time. They were willing to stay with the momentum. As that momentum died, they were quickly turning more bearish, and then they got hit with, the tariff surprise. They had every reason to say, oh my God, the bust is here. And that's what you've heard for the last 2 weeks, I think, is people are anywhere from the top is in, we've seen the highs. We're now going to be in a major bear market that could take us down 30, 40, 50, 60%. And then there are others that say, well, we at least have to go back and retest the lows. So at least get back to that 48 and maybe go back to, say, 4,500. Some are even talking, the less bearish, but still bearish, are talking like the low 4,000.
Yeah.
I just don't think that's likely. Anything's possible. But what I see is that we had our retest earlier this week. Didn't get all the way down there, but we retested. You saw some of that same panic or concern come quickly back. We had that bounce that started with a huge bounce. And as long as it was going up, people were willing to ride it. Most were saying, sell into this, but they were willing to ride it. But as soon as that thing turned south a couple of days ago, you heard the same voices back again saying, see, I told you this was just a bear market rally and you better get out.
Yeah.
And then obviously that lasted a day and we're right back, on the climb out of the hole. And I think we've got potentially before, and, this is just a guess, but maybe another few hundred points before we have some consolidation up there. And that consolidation probably doesn't take us, it might take us back to here, but not much below here. And maybe not even. And then I think we keep climbing from there. So yes, I think the bottom is in. Doesn't mean it's a straight line. There'll be periods, coming days and weeks, where you're going to have reason for the bears to come back out of the woodwork and say, see, I told you it's going down. Some of it will be 2, 3, 4 day type sell-off. Could last a little longer than that, but I don't think it's, long drawn out consolidation.
So aside from that, you feel like we're on a one-way ticket higher?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be Pollyannish and say that you can't have posts on Truth Social that scare the hell out of people or get people right back to saying, oh my God, we can't get out of this mess, or this is going to go on for a long time. So you can get volatility. I'm giving you my best guess of what I think could happen, but I don't want people to think that I have any kind of vision of what's coming here. It certainly, I do feel pretty strongly that we've seen the lows, or if we haven't seen the lows, the retest is going to be successful just below the lows. I don't even think that's likely, but if we get a retest, I think it'll be successful. But in terms of the day-to-day, boy,
it's impossible to know. But, you spoke about the non-committal nature to this market. The fear is just right below the surface. People are tense, right? They're looking for reasons to sell. I feel like, for the first time, the debt matters. The tariffs have sort of given countries an excuse to zoom out, look at the United States and say, wow, they're going through 37 trillion in debt. This debt ceiling fiasco is coming, right? The US is expected to default, by July, unless they raise the ceiling, which, of course they will. But it feels different. It feels like the world has an excuse to sell America, to look for other places, right? You've long talked about US treasuries and coming back to the dollar as a flight of safety. We did not see that this time, right? Biggest volatility, some of the biggest sell-offs since the 1920s. People were dumping the dollar. Do you expect that trend to reverse?
Yeah, keep in mind, I've had a dollar forecast of it was 80 and it raised to 82 sometime last year. So I've been looking for a big decline in dollar. When it was back up at 109, I was told I was a fool, that I had no idea what the dollar was on a big run back to the 115 and higher.
Yes. Yeah.
And that was the top, and it rolled right back from 109, and we're below par, and I think we're probably going to see it down into the mid 90s before we may consolidate for a few weeks or something. But ultimately, I think we're going a lot lower. And I had that forecast. I didn't think it'd take this long to get there. I had that forecast while I was very bullish about stocks. So I'm not changing my mind just because the dollar's down. That was actually what I expected. So, and I have a 130 on the euro versus the US dollar. When it got down into almost down to 100, I think, I was told I didn't, there's no way you're going to see anything close to that. Euro's going down. And now we're at 114 and change, and looks like 130 might be low. So, yes, there's a lot of concern about, the U.S. losing as the leader of the world, the idea that we are kind of different than everybody else and they can stand above the crowd. Everybody's worried about that. I'm very optimistic about what Trump is trying to do. It's going to be messy getting there. It's certainly a far bigger challenge than any president has ever undertaken in terms of trying to turn around 40 years of bad policy. I mean, we gave away the store for 40 years. And, you can't turn that around in 2 weeks. And you can't, he gets a lot of advice from all these experts out there, experts meaning people at their kitchen table a lot of the time, but even the so-called experts, that, I like what he's trying to do, but he shouldn't have been so abrupt. He should have been, more gradual. You're not going to get this turned around with gradual policy. Right now, he's negotiating. There's a lot of what we're getting. The funny thing is, I think Wall Street believed him more than the trading partners. He's playing hardball. He had Wall Street convinced that he plans to keep these tariffs in place because he likes the remedies. Wall Street bought that hook, line, and sinker. That's why they sold off. Our trading partners, I think, some of that is real and some of that is posturing.
But David, you talked about it getting messy. I mean, is that not enough to trigger the bust that you've been forecasting?
Let's put it this way. I think we could find that some of what we're dealing with now, China can talk tough. They went into this with a weak hand in terms of their economy was already reeling. I mean, the real estate situation there is a mess. And their economy, we used to hear, a few years ago, if China's GDP was below their reported 6%, I think they were saying at the time, they're in crisis. Well, they're down closer to zero now. I mean, in reported numbers, I don't know what they're reporting, a couple percent maybe, but people were worried about revolt then. Yeah. You add in the fact that they're probably, they are in negative GDP, they are seeing deflation, and at the same time, you add in this, they can talk tough, but they can't stay tough for very long. I mean, they're going to have to negotiate, and Trump wants to negotiate. So it's just a matter of when the two egos kind of back down a little bit and say, hey, let's talk. So that's coming. China's going to be the tougher nut. I think you'll see, the UK and Japan and India, South Korea, some of those countries probably are going to, you're going to have deals announced in the next several weeks. So that'll help put pressure on China.
The pressure is building on China in a big way. One of my neighbors imports a lot of things and has a factory over there. And he said he has 200 containers sitting in the port, can't move them, can't import them. And don't think he's alone, right? There's thousands of guys like that.
And think about their entire economy. It's based on not just the goods they ship, but also shipping itself. We worry about our port shutting down and the unemployment's going to come. What about them? I mean, they've got the biggest ports in the world, many of them, and they're just not going to be able to ship to the biggest market they have. So I'm not trying to make it sound like China's not going to play hardball for a little while, but I just think cooler heads will prevail at some point on both sides, because we get hurt too. But to go back to the original question, how about the bust? Yeah, I mean, the risks are higher that if this thing doesn't get resolved in some reasonable period of time, that we just watch everything, the world economy go down. And that's why we had the sell-off we had. Question, and why everybody's bearish. I don't dismiss the idea that some of what is coming out of this will be part of why down the road we'll have a bust. Down the road meaning within the next 12 months and maybe within the next 7 or 8 months. It's not going to be evident in the next few months. I think what you're going to likely have, which is why I think you'll have the melt-up. I think the narrative that drives that, it's going to become clear to even the Fed, who's slow to catch on, that we're in recession before the end of this quarter.